Hi everyone, my name is Lindsay. I am a great ape keeper, and today we're going to be talking about the history of ape language, the great apes that were involved, and eventually the downfall of this area of science. Also, I am working on a different format, longer videos that are a little less frequent, so let me know if you prefer these over my usual format of like 10-ish minute videos posted weekly, or a little bit longer video that's posted every few weeks. I'm happy to do either, but now let's get on to the video. Ape language research is an area of research where scientists have tried to see if non-human great apes, such as chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, and bonobos, can communicate similar to humans. Over the last century, many attempts to teach apes language have tried and failed, so we're going to look at the history of ape language and eventually where it all went wrong. Richard Garner. Richard Lynch Garner was born February 19, 1848. After joining the Civil War for the Confederate Army at 14, he attended Jefferson Academy for Men in Tennessee. When he graduated, he became a school teacher, but his interest in Charles Darwin and the theory of evolution soon grew into a passion that he couldn't ignore. He believed that human speech might have originated from animal sounds. Primates use a range of vocalizations to communicate with their other members of their group, and Garner was curious to see if these vocalizations could be recorded and deciphered. He acquired a phonograph created by the famous Thomas Edison and spent hours recording vocalizations from monkeys at zoos across the country. In 1891, he wrote an article, The Simian Tongue, in which he argued that the lower primates have a rudimentary language, and that this language is the origin of human speech. This was his claim to fame, and eventually it helped him travel to Africa to study wild primates. The next year, Garner went to Africa to study gorillas. He discovered that gorillas were not these big, meaty, aggressive creatures, and he also published these findings and received a ton of praise for them. This praise managed to raise him the funds for a trip to study chimpanzees in Gabon. Among the donors were scientists such as Edison, Alexander Melville Bell, and Grover Cleveland. With the chimpanzees, he attempted to decipher the chimp's language, even going as far as to teach one of the chimpanzees simple words. After his time in Gabon, he decided to return home, and in 1910 he brought a chimpanzee named Susie back to the United States. He attempted to prove that she knew hundreds of English words. Unfortunately, he was a very disorganized individual, and many of the methods he used to collect data were not scientific. He received a lot of criticism for his work in Gabon. Besides this, his belief was that within a few generations, chimpanzees' affinity for knowledge sharing would produce an entire family of English-speaking apes. Unfortunately, this dream did not come to reality, and as the years went on, most of Garner's works were either disproven or heavily criticized. Although Garner was unsuccessful in having his own talking chimpanzee, he did inspire several scientists 20 years later to finish what he started. Gwa the chimp. Gwa the chimp was born November 15, 1930 at the Yerkes Primate Center. She was raised by scientists Luella and Winthrop Kellogg alongside the Kellogg's son Donald. This was the first instance of apes being raised in a cross-rearing study. For 9 months, the two were raised as brother and sister. Around 1 year old, Gwa was actually testing higher than Donald in certain cognitive tasks. These tasks included responding to simple commands or knowing how to use utensils and cups. For the most part, they grew up at very similar rates. However, once Donald started using words to communicate, the stark contrast between the two became very visible. Gwa could not speak. She used grunts and gestures to ask for what she wanted. She often mimicked Donald, but never learned how to speak properly. The research was abruptly ended when Donald started to grunt and gesture like Gwa. Gwa was returned to Yerkes, where she died of pneumonia at just 3 years old. Vicki the chimpanzee. Vicki was another chimpanzee that showed early promise into ape language research. Vicki was raised by Keith and Catherine Hayes as a human infant. They wanted to see if she could learn to speak like a human. She was given speech therapy, which involved her caretakers physically manipulating her lower jaw until she could produce 4 words: mama, papa, up, and cup. Her caretakers recorded these research findings and determined that she was incapable of simultaneous recruitment of consonantal frames and vowel-like content, but she was successfully producing a small sample of human-like speech sounds. Although the success was limited and mostly unsuccessful, later experiments forced scientists to confront the fact that it wasn't that apes didn't understand language, they just needed the proper tools to communicate. Later studies using American Sign Language and symbols showed promise in this field, indicating that apes did have the capacity for language, but their physiological limitations, such as vocal constriction and neural pathways, had prevented them from speaking. But with the right outlet of communication, success was possible. At the age of 4, Vicki was relocated to the Yerkes Primate Lab in Florida. They attempted to socialize her with other groups of chimpanzees. I don't really know how successful they were at this task, but from what I know about hand-reared apes, it was more than likely not an easy feat. Unfortunately, at the age of 7, she contracted viral encephalitis, which caused massive brain swelling and damage. After several weeks, she passed away just shy of her 7th birthday. I also need to note that this trope of sacrificing the mental well-being of great apes for the betterment of science will be very prominent in this episode. I will talk about the ethics of ape language later, but I want to put it in the back of your mind as you listen to the rest of this episode. Gua was taken from her mother at 7.5 months old. She was raised outside of a normal chimp childhood and then promptly returned to a chimp society once a human offspring was negatively affected. Vicki had a very similar upbringing and also died very young. This double standard is very common in ape language research, even into the later years, where it was apparent that this was severely detrimental to an ape's well-being. Sign language. Washoe was born in West Africa in 1965. She was captured by the U.S. Air Force for research purposes. In 1967, a couple named R. Allen Garner and Beatrix Garner designed a project to help teach Washoe American Sign Language. They believed that previous attempts to teach language were flawed because they were too focused on having chimpanzees communicate how humans communicate. And maybe chimpanzees were capable of language, they just needed the proper outlet. In the wild, chimpanzees use gestures to communicate. So the reasoning was that a gesture-focused language would be a better way to teach young Washoe. They started teaching Washoe basic signs like you, me, food, and hug. Washoe was also raised like a human child and often went on car rides with the couple. One day, as they were driving, Washoe spotted a swan swimming in a pond. She signed water bird. As insignificant as this may seem, this opened the floodgates for the world of ape language. Not only could Washoe assign words to physical objects, but she could combine words to specify those objects. A swan is a bird in water. Although Washoe did not have a sign for swan, she could use the words she already knew to communicate the same thing. This shows a mental dexterity that was not previously observed in apes at this time. Washoe learned around 350 words through a conversation communication style. Her caretakers would rarely talk to her and communicated specifically with ASL. They discovered that although she did not immediately use novel words introduced to her, she would remember them and use them later. For example, if her caretaker showed her a tomato and signed tomato, Washoe wouldn't immediately sign tomato back. But a few days later, when a tomato was introduced, she would sign tomato unprompted. Moreover, scientist Roger S. Fauch saw Washoe as an opportunity to show what adaptive communication can do to benefit humans. Fauch believed that teaching ASL to nonverbal autistic children would open a whole new world for autistic children and their families. Since Washoe didn't have the hand dexterity that humans do, Fauch designed an adaptive ASL language that would help Washoe communicate. This allowed for easier communication. Fauch also discovered that chimpanzees who were taught sign language also taught and communicated with each other. Washoe gave birth to 2 infants, but unfortunately due to her unnatural upbringing, she didn't make the best mother, and both the infants died. She did, however, adopt an older infant and was observed teaching him over 70 ASL words, further opening the idea that language is cultural and can be taught. Nim Chimpsky. Nim Chimpsky was born in 1973. Project Nim was an extension of Project Washoe with one change. They wanted to see if chimpanzees were capable of grammar and syntax. However, this is where we start to see the umbrella of ape language become a little more unconventional. Nim was taken from his sedated mother at just a few days old and sent to live with Stephanie Lafarge in New York City. This arrangement was fraught with issues. Lafarge had no idea how to care for an infant chimp and was often found breastfeeding Nim even though she had no milk and smoking pot around him.
Stop it. Get some help.
They would periodically teach him signs but rarely kept records of it. The team moved to the Bronx for a more professional setting. Nim exhibited extreme anxiety and could not be alone for more than a few minutes. If left with someone that was unknown to him, he would throw tantrums, ripping his clothes off and defecating all over the place. With the fast turnover rate of staff, it further caused extreme anxiety in Nim, and he became more aggressive and less willing to do work. It was also determined that Nim was more than likely mimicking his caretakers, instead of actually learning language. They would use operant conditioning and positive reinforcement that encouraged Nim to communicate for rewards. This issue was that it can't prove that apes actually learn language or just mimic it. Humans learn language through immersion and often slowly understanding grammar over time. Nim was not taught that way, and unfortunately it was assumed that chimps could not learn to communicate in full sentences. Because of this fast turnover of staff, the ASL training was not consistent, and oftentimes Nim was taught signs that were wrong. By now you can probably see where I'm going with this. Shockingly to no one, the study failed. Nim tragically died from a heart attack at 26, nearly half the normal lifespan of a captive male chimp. Koko the gorilla. Koko is arguably one of the most famous apes in great ape language research. She is a western lowland gorilla that was born at the San Francisco Zoo on July 4th, 1971. Francine Patterson was her caretaker, and she would host showings where people could observe Patterson teaching young Koko sign language. After a couple years, Patterson convinced the zoo to move Koko to Stanford after she showed significant promise in learning language. Now, at the time Koko was born, it was widely assumed that gorillas were these brutish, brainless animals that weren't capable of learning language. Genetically speaking, we are closer in relation to chimpanzees than chimpanzees are to gorillas. So for chimps to learn language, it is more believable than a gorilla understanding language. Koko showed that the great ape taxonomy is more complex than we think and suggested that language evolved way earlier than previously accepted. Koko's claim to fame was the National Geographic story Koko's Kitten. This tells of a story of Koko receiving a kitten and taking care of it as if it were a gorilla infant. Like I said earlier, this gave the perception of gorillas an entirely new light. She wasn't a violent animal, she was capable of being gentle enough to care for a kitten, and when the kitten suddenly passed away, Koko supposedly expressed sadness, signing sad, frown, and cry. Although Koko was wildly popular, the science behind her was heavily criticized. Patterson made claims of Koko's intelligence that weren't true, and many believed that she mainly mimicked her keepers and not actually using language unprompted. Patterson also claimed that Koko would talk in full sentences, but didn't have much proof, and her videos mainly showed that Koko had no understanding of grammar. Not only that, but Patterson had major beef with the San Francisco Zoo, because she had managed to convince them to move Koko to Stanford. Patterson figured that if she could acquire another gorilla, she could trade and keep Koko. So she illegally obtained 2 infant gorillas, allegedly. The female was going to be sent to San Francisco Zoo, and the male was going to live with Koko. Unfortunately, the female died soon after transport. Patterson then launched a huge campaign to gain custody of Koko. This piggybacked off of the failure of the Nim study in 1979, and the funding for ape language had dried up. So Patterson turned her sights away from science and spent the rest of her time procuring funding for Koko and her family. Patterson established the Gorilla Foundation, and Koko, Michael, and another gorilla, Nadume, were finally established at the compound in Stanford University. However, there was heavy criticism over the care practices at the compound. While Patterson was fervently defending her work with Koko, she rarely let anyone besides certain care staff work with the apes. She also didn't follow a normal gorilla diet, and Koko ballooned to over 270 pounds. A normal female gorilla is around 150 to 200 pounds. Gorillas are also vegetarians, but the gorillas were recorded being fed meat, non-alcoholic beer, and candy. There were also claims of neglect of the other gorillas, and the main focus being on Koko and teaching her language. This abuse continued as both the male gorillas and care staff were being abused. The most notable of this was what we call nipplegate. Koko was not raised like a normal gorilla and didn't have any sexual interest in the other male gorillas, which often led them to be confined to small enclosures for long periods of time. She also had a fixation with nipples, which led to a lawsuit filed by 3 female employees when, upon meeting Koko, Patterson asked if they could reveal their nipples to Koko. Patterson made remarks like, "Oh yes, Koko, Nancy has nice nipples. Nancy, can you show her your nipples?" and then proceeded to make statements about them like, "Oh, look, Koko, she has big nipples."
That's suspicious.
Yeah, it's fine.
That's weird.
After this, the controversy and the lack of funding, Patterson would resign her work with Koko, and Koko and her gorilla family were moved to a preserve in California. At the preserve, Koko also met and interacted with a variety of celebrities, including Robin Williams, Betty White, William Shatner, Leonardo DiCaprio, and Peter Gabriel. She died in 2018 at the age of 46, a fairly normal age for a captive gorilla. Ndume was transferred to the Cincinnati Zoo not long after, and the Gorilla Foundation was officially closed. Although Koko didn't make a significant jump scientifically in ape language, she did prove that gorillas have the capacity to be gentle, intelligent beings, and further help the protection of her species. She also kept the ape language research alive, at least for a short time, due to her fame. Kanzi. Kanzi was born in 1980 at the Yerkes Primate Center in Georgia. Kanzi is a bonobo, which is very closely related to a chimpanzee and is one of our closest living relatives. He was born to Mother Laurel, but within a few days he was adopted by the matriarch of the group, Matata. Sue Savage Rumbaugh wanted to see if Matata could learn language by using arbitrary symbols on a keyboard. These symbols were called lexicograms. Each lexigram is designed to be semantically and syntactically unequivocal. So, lexicograms that were red identified digestible foods and drinks, like juice and banana, and lexicograms that were blue represented activities like chase and tickle, etc. While teaching Matata these symbols, she showed little interest in learning. Matata was a wild-caught bonobo and had already reached sexual maturity. She didn't really see the importance of learning a new language. However, during this time, she was caring for Kanzi. Kanzi was slowly observing, and he noticed that the board could be used to get food. One day, Kanzi unpromptedly asked for food. From then on, the study was shifted, and Kanzi became the star of the show. Kanzi showed an incredible knack for using the lexigram and understanding spoken English. Sue would cover her head and ask Kanzi, "Can you put the tomato in the fridge?" And Kanzi would do the task. Another experiment with a similar finding had Kanzi wearing headphones while a caretaker in the other room would ask him to give a certain photo to a caretaker standing next to him. Kanzi did this with terrifying accuracy. Kanzi also showed an incredible fluency of the lexigram. Not only could he use words to tell his caretakers what he wanted, but he could also combine words to further convey what he was asking for. Caretakers would talk of times where Kanzi would see a pizza and call it tomato cheese bread surprise, or see someone eating a bagel with cream cheese and call it cheese toothpaste and open bread, or requesting snow from outside, calling it outside ice. Kanzi was incredibly intelligent and incredibly food motivated. This made him the perfect candidate for Sue's studies. In 2005, Kanzi and his bonobo family were moved to Des Moines, Iowa to the Great Ape Trust, where Sue had unlimited funds and unlimited freedoms to conduct research with Kanzi and other bonobos, including Pambanisha and Inyota. In 2010, Tico was born. Sue claimed that Kanzi was the father and that Tico would be the future of ape language. She claimed that Kanzi, Tico, and a couple other bonobos were being raised biculturally, meaning being raised half bonobo, half human. She believed that since Kanzi was young when he started using the lexicograms, that if she could raise a bonobo from infancy to adulthood, that maybe Tico could reach the same successes. Sue wouldn't get a chance to do this because a couple years later, the main donor pulled out and the money dried up. He claimed that the trust was no longer aligned with his vision for the original center. And for the most part, that was true. Kanzi was becoming more of a sideshow attraction, and they weren't doing much research in ape language. Moreover, Kanzi and many of his bonobo family were severely overweight. Kanzi being almost 250 pounds when an average male bonobo is around 100 to 130 pounds. Sue herself was also becoming not fit for the job and took a leave of absence. In that time, Jared Tagliatella took over the day-to-day operations and eventually became director. Fortunately for Kanzi and his family, the organizations made adjustments to the care of the bonobos, focusing on non-invasive behavioral research, species-appropriate diets, causing Kanzi to lose 100 pounds, and setting the bonobos up for success in the future. Now the organization has been renamed the Ape Initiative, care for the bonobos have been upgraded, and the humans are no longer allowed to interact with the apes without proper PPE and protective barriers. Jared still saw the value in bonobo research and felt that Kanzi and the other bonobos at Ape Initiative still had a lot to offer. Now, Ape Initiative works with researchers from all over the country to do behavioral and cognitive research to further understand bonobo intelligence. And up until his death in March of 2025, Kanzi was participating in behavioral research studies that help scientists better understand bonobos and their intelligence. Controversy. Kanzi's death signified the last flame of ape research. There were several reasons why this area of study died off, mostly because researchers learned everything they were going to learn about language. Non-human apes have the capacity to memorize words and symbols and use them to communicate basic needs. What great apes can't grasp is grammar and syntax, and they can't fully form grammatically correct sentences. It's also very difficult to interpret ape language. We as humans have our own biases, and many scientists are guilty of seeing things that aren't there. Many of the ape caretakers believe that their apes and their language abilities were way higher than they actually were. It is also incredibly difficult to prove if an ape is communicating through pleasure/necessity or simply mimicking their care staff in order to get a reward. It happens often in this field where claims about animals' intelligence were made without much proof except, "Trust me, bro." On top of this, the researchers who took care of these animals didn't see the issue with the mental degradation that an ape like this gets without a normal upbringing. If these apes are raised like humans from a young age, they miss important milestones within their own species. Even today, caretakers struggle to introduce these animals back into conspecific societies. These apes have trouble socializing normally and are at risk for serious injury and even death because of it. On top of this, the ethical sacrifices these apes have to make in order to do this research is not worth the knowledge we gain from learning it. As you can probably tell, these apes were stripped from their mothers at a young age, raised in an unnatural way, and if they made it to adulthood, they struggled to have any semblance of a normal, non-human ape life. It's not worth sacrificing their well-being, in my opinion. The research also does not benefit humans enough to warrant the sacrifice. It is merely a thought experiment. There's also so much we can be learning from these guys through non-invasive ethical research. What's next? Although the age of ape intelligence is gone as we know it, it is not totally dead. In fact, it's thriving. There is value in learning about these animals in a more natural setting. The more we learn about them, the more we learn about ourselves, but we can do it in a way that is beneficial for both parties. Scientists have to get creative to design experiments that animals want to participate in willingly. Computer games, table tasks, and observations are much more beneficial to this field of study than raising a non-human ape like a human. It also doubles as enrichments for these animals, and they can choose to participate in them. Scientists are still working to understand ape cognition and how their evolution aligns with ours. I'll leave some links to some pretty cool discoveries made in the field of cognition recently, so be sure to check those out. And that's all I got for you guys today. If you guys have any suggestions for future videos, let me know. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye.